Hi, Nick. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. We'll always start with the same first question. So, what has been the hardest change that's happened to you in your life?
Well, Gareth, look, thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to be on the other side because I host a podcast myself. I've been scratching my head at this question the last couple of days, and if I look back into my past life, I was finding it really difficult to come up with something. I've been very fortunate that I haven't had many life-changing moments. I haven't had a serious illness. I haven't moved country. I've moved cities between London, Birmingham, and Manchester, but they're all fairly major cities, so it wasn't anything too dramatic. I haven't had perhaps a huge career move, so I was struggling a bit. So I wanted to flip it slightly and perhaps talk about maybe a big challenge I've had and how I've overcome it, especially in the professional workplace. And um, I was very fortunate at deverellsmith to be given the opportunity to lead the build to rent division. And I guess there was no expectation of what I do and the types of things I had to do. But um, as sort of a leader, I wanted to be someone who is a thought leader and someone who can stand up in front of people and give talks. And there was an instance 3 years ago where I was asked to stand up in front of just deverellsmith internally, about 100 people, absolutely froze, heart raced. I had a panic attack,
Oh,
and
wow.
it absolutely knocked my confidence, and not just wasn't just for public speaking. It led into a flurry of panic attacks and other situations, whether that would be meeting with a client or being in a situation perhaps where it could make me feel uncomfortable. So it really knocked me, and what I decided to do for 2 years is to do nothing, and it basically avoided any situation which I thought would cause myself to have a panic attack. So basically, public situations was a big no for me. Um, but then on the other side, I'm building this brilliant career at deverellsmith, and I had a decision to make. Either I just decide, yeah, public speaking is not for me. I never want to try it again, or I do something about it. So I decided, let's do something about it. So I spoke to friends and family. I got given various bits of advice, and what I was told to look at is something called hypnotherapy. And people might, when people say hypnotherapy, they might think of hypnotists and what they see on the TV, and it's not perhaps as theatrical as putting you to sleep. It's what hypnotherapy is in a nutshell is it allows you, well, it changes your state of mind, and it puts you in a deep sense of relaxation. And what it helped me to do was, you talk to a therapist on a weekly basis. It was on Zoom, which is incredibly easy. They put you in this state of relaxation, and they help you manage your breathing, and help you imagine being in these situations of speaking to 100 people, 1,000 people, and they give you different tools of how to manage those moments where you think you might have the sort of the rush of breathing or the panic attack. And that was absolutely the game changer for me. And I purposely challenged myself to do something at the end of that process to see basically if it would work. So I was very fortunate to be asked to sit on a panel at a conference with the UK AA. Wasn't a huge group of people; it was probably about 70 people, but enough for me that that's the sort of
Big
challenge
enough.
I
Yeah.
did. And I did it, and I felt horrible the night before, felt horrible on the day, but using all the tips I was taught from the hypnotherapist, it worked, and I was absolutely fine. And actually, by sort of halfway through, I was really enjoying it. And I told myself after, right, great, you've overcome your fear. Let's keep going. So I then decided I volunteered to speak in front of the company again. We host something called bar stools, and bar stools when someone literally sits on a bar stool and they talk about anything they want. So I spoke about productivity and how to be, I guess, work smarter rather than not necessarily harder, work smarter. That was in front of about 65 people, and that actually was more nerve wracking for me because I'm speaking in front of people who've seen me have, I don't want to say fail, that in my eyes I called it a failure, but have seen me struggle before. That was only a couple of weeks ago, and it went brilliantly, and everybody came up to me after saying how good they thought it was. So I want to keep going. A friend from university's asked me to be his best man, which is a very nice position to be in. So I've got to do a best man speech in October. So it's an ongoing process. I think I've overcome the first hurdle, but I want to keep going. And I guess I wanted to bring this example up because I think I assume most people don't really like public speaking, and there's probably a lot of people who've never tried it before and want to. And I guess this is just a nice example of what you can do if you're anxious about it.
No, thanks very much for sharing. And I guess a couple of things come to mind. Is the first one I think maybe you've answered is, are you still having to keep practice those techniques that you learned in hypnotherapy? And
Yeah.
I guess the other question is, given you were speaking and you had that, in front of colleagues and your team, essentially as a leader in the team, like, do you think that they respected you more for coming back and doing it? Sort of, that vulnerability, showing that.
Yeah, I think look, because Deverell Smith, it's recruitment. We've hired a lot of people since then, so a lot of people probably didn't know, and it was sort of
Yeah,
my secret. But there were sort of that legacy group who were there before, who knew how uncomfortable it made me feel. So um, they were very nice about it after, and actually asking some advice for themselves. So that was a really fortunate thing. To answer your first question, absolutely, it's an ongoing process. It's not that I had the therapy a year ago and I haven't done anything since then. They teach you, I guess, coping mechanisms to continue in future. So what my therapist introduced me to is mindfulness, and you can do mindfulness in lots of different ways, but essentially it's meditation. So there's various apps you can use. I use Headspace. I'd love to say I use it every day. I don't, unfortunately. Life just gets in the way, but I will tend to do a mindfulness session perhaps a day before an event where I'm speaking, or just when you're feeling a little bit like you just need that extra little bit of support, and it really brings you back to gives you a level head.
I think that's really, really good advice. And yeah, I get the notifications daily from the mindfulness apps, and you always press mute or silence it or
Yeah.
go
I
away.
think
And perhaps you shouldn't. Perhaps I should listen to
I
a bit
think
more.
I think Gareth as well. The other thing to complement this, and I think we all know these things, but it's doing the basics. It's having enough sleep every night, eating a healthy diet, drinking lots of water, exercising. We all know that we should do these things and they make you feel better, but we, as humans, we do neglect them, and I'm definitely guilty for that. Um, but I have learned when I'm actually doing those things, drinking less alcohol as well, um, puts me in a much better state of mind. So that sort of partnered with hypnotherapy and the mindfulness um, just puts you in a much better space.
I think I always used to have too much caffeine before speaking publicly. It
Yeah,
was always used to
yeah,
either make me talk too much or a bit jittery. So that was something I learned not to do. Um,
absolutely. Yeah, I've cut down to two max a day now.
so I guess everybody has an opinion about recruitment and what
Yeah.
you guys do. How would you describe what you do?
Yeah. So, well, look, my role's actually changed quite recently. So I look after executive hires. So if you look at the organogram of a business, it's basically more of a strategic decision maker. So that could be the CEO, could be the operations director, the HR director, someone who's come in who is transformative and looking to make change. Um, and that's a really exciting. It's been a really eye-opening and exciting space to be in, because I guess the way we go and find those people is different to perhaps the usual methodology people usually think. We're not creating job adverts, and we're not scouring job boards. We're actually, there's a much more methodical approach to go and find those people. I have a full-time researcher work for me. You know, Rachel, she's an absolute brain box. She doesn't recruit day to day, but what she does is map and identify the market, and knows a lot more about the market than myself. And she will identify everyone that perhaps could, fits the mandate that I'm working on. And I guess when I look at executive search, I look at we're doing it the correct way, and we're finding the right people for the right companies.
So do you think recruitment and recruiters sometimes get a bad reputation?
Yeah, I absolutely. Look, it's a saturated market. It's not regulated, and I do think that. And don't get me wrong, there's some brilliant recruiters out there that we know of, but their standards have slipped, and some just basic things like communication um, would go a long way. So it's frustrating when uh, I guess people base their experiences to have a view of everyone in the sector. I promise that's not always the case, and I guess what the advice is, it's trying to find the right people, and you can do that through asking your friends, because the recruitment market is important to getting people in work and ensuring that. unemployment is as low as possible.
I think one thing that I've sort of been thinking about recently and talking to a couple of clients about recently is there still seems to be a hangover from the pandemic, and it seems like nobody really talks about it anymore, and we're just sort of shuffling our way through, and it's, you know, if you had a critical incident in your business, you would sit down and review it and see what went wrong, and it feels like we haven't done that for the pandemic. So I guess a couple of things. One was, what was it like recruiting during the pandemic in your sector, and you know, has it had a lasting effect on recruitment going forward?
Yeah, pandemic was a very scary period. You know, we, overnight we were working on a number of mandates, and literally the next day when we put into lockdown, everything got put on hold or cancelled until further notice. So I guess, the business, what it was transacting, went from 100% to 30% in a matter of days, which is very scary. Fortunately, we had the furlough scheme, and we put 70% of our consultants on the furlough scheme, but we kept a group of us to continue working. I was one of them, which I was very grateful for, because I sort of needed work for my own sanity. But look, it was a fairly painful experience, trying to speak with clients and see if there's anything you can do in any work, when frankly the instruction from most companies is that we are on a hiring freeze. So that was a painful process, but economic downturns for me aren't always negative. Actually, in an economic downturn, actually that's when a lot of people become out of work, or they start looking for work, and they're vulnerable. And for me, that's when you build the strongest relationships, because you're really helping people in their vulnerable state. And I've built some of the best relationships with people who I placed during the pandemic or post it as well. And it's absolutely the same, in the current economic environment. It's certainly not as tricky as the pandemic was, but there are some similar aspects. And I think my advice to anyone who perhaps is struggling, whether you're a recruiter or any sort of service industry where you're selling into something, if you're quiet, just use this as an opportunity to build those relationships, because when the market turns and starts again, that's when you'll start reaping the rewards. I think, to answer your question about hangover from COVID, there were a lot of good things that came out of the pandemic that we've continued to do, things like working remotely and using technology to improve processes. And I think there's a Zoom and Microsoft Teams in the recruitment world is actually a really positive thing. It speeds up times, it helps, it reduces the time for people to get to interview, and it helps the processes. But I don't think we can completely rely on technology to do absolutely everything. I still think face-to-face contact is actually one of the most valuable things you can do. And I think I encourage my colleagues to get out there and meet people as much as possible if they really want to build long-lasting relationships. I think for the clients that we're recruiting for, flexibility is now an expectation, and there's a bit of a split argument. Some people are saying we're going back to 5 days a week in the office. Some people think we won't. I still think we are absolutely somewhere in the middle there.
No, that makes sense. And I guess the sector you recruit into is obviously build to rent. Not everyone is familiar with build to rent and what that term means. So
Yep.
How would you describe build to rent?
Absolutely. I'll put my investor hat on. Build to rent is I say new and emerging. It's been new and emerging for the past decade, but it's a growing subsector of the private rental sector, or PRS. And simply, it's where developers will build blocks of apartments with the sole purpose that the apartments are available for renting rather than sale. And this concept is growing in popularity, because if we look at society, more people are renting than ever, and that's caused for a couple of reasons. One, buying property is more unaffordable, but also there's been a secular shift where people perhaps at a younger age are renting for longer. They want that flexibility. They want to try out different cities and try out different jobs before committing to buy a property. The government are very much behind the sector as well, because, as we know, there's a housing crisis in the UK, and they need to provide more housing. So build to rent sort of meets their standards as well. And investors like it because it brings in consistent income on a monthly basis through rent. And even during a high inflationary environment or a pandemic or any sort of recession, people will always need a roof over their head. So it's a very resilient sector during an economic downturn. In terms of why it's positive for the customer, the view is of private rental sector is it's a pretty ugly point of view. People think of poor service, rogue landlords, and poor housing. And the idea of build to rent, it's professionally managed, it's heavily amenitized. So a lot of these buildings will be built in city centres near good transport links. They might have things like a gym on site, shared living spaces, work zones, which is really appropriate for more people working from home. Spaces where they can interact with their neighbours, and you can build a community. So that's been really interesting. So the type of build to rent which has been popular perhaps the last decade is your high rise build to rent, and what I mean by that is a block of apartments in city centres. And while that's great, if you actually look at the demographic of private renters across the UK, the majority of those people, perhaps a high-rise apartment isn't actually suitable for them. They might have pets, they might have a couple of dogs or cats, they might have children, and what they actually need is space. So what we've seen the sector do is actually subsectors are emerging. So we're seeing something called suburban build to rent or single family housing. And essentially that's sort of a neighborhood of single unit properties, again, owned by one developer or landlord, and they're rented rather than sold. And we're really seeing that emerging across the UK. And over the past 10 years, most of the build to rent portfolio has been based in London, but it's really grown nationally, and the regions have overtaken London. And today, in terms of how many apartments there are, we're currently at just over 80,000 apartments are PC'd, open and live, and have people living within them. There's a gigantic pipeline, and several are predicted by 2030 will be somewhat around 350,000 build to rent units nationwide.
Okay, so a couple of things came out of that. One is I've been keeping a keen eye on the single family housing, sort of emergence of build to rent. We do love a term that nobody understands in the industry, don't we? SFH, BTR, multifamily, PRS. I guess. So what's the main differences recruiting in build to rent as opposed to PRS? What are you looking for? Are you looking for anything different in build to rent?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organogram of the business and how they're set up. If I look at sectors like hospitality or PBSA, for example, which is perhaps what you were doing before, there's a typical structure which you see and most buildings will have an accommodation manager or general manager, will have a front of house team, a salesperson, housekeeping, maintenance. And most build to rent companies are sort of adopting that similar structure. But these single family or PRS, or these sort of suburban BTR neighborhoods where it's not sort of enclosed in one block of apartments and there isn't communal areas, perhaps a different structure is needed, and it might not be an on-site team. It might just simply be, again, a property manager and a lettings person, and they might be working in a local estate agent office. It really depends on the spec of the building. If it's a very community light and they haven't got space where perhaps there's an on-site team, it will have someone in probably an office who regularly visits the site but is that sort of point of contact. Whereas a build to rent scheme almost operating sort of hotel style service where there very much is that sort of face-to-face contact. And for me, in my opinion, the preferred option, because you can really deliver proper customer experience face-to-face.
It might be a bit of a leading question, but if, with completed under construction or in planning, for build to rents, around 250,000 at the end of last year. Where are you looking to recruit talent from into build to rent? Because clearly, if the sector's going from, I can't remember how many you said, 80-something thousand already live to 250,000, in the space of probably a couple of years, where are you going to find all the great people to look after these residents?
It's a very good point, Gareth, and actually I think you put it very politely, and I'm not scared to be blunt. I think the recruitment market in build-to-rent is heading for an absolute train wreck. And it's a simple supply and demand issue. I'm making a guesstimation here, but as I said, 80,000 apartments live. In terms of how many people exist to operate those buildings, I guess it's been more and more difficult to track the exact number, but I would put it somewhere in the region of maybe 1,000 to 1,500. Could be a little bit more. Again, it depends because every company's set up slightly differently. But let's say there's that many people in the sector at the moment, and we're growing to 350,000. So we're growing by over 4 times. So the amount of people that work in the sector, there's not enough people to service the future growth that's coming. Yet what happens is that, we're very grateful when the client picks up the phone and wants us to hire a general manager or a front of house person or mobilize a brand new team. We're very delighted to get that call. But what's frustrating is that, people want people with sector experience, and it's that action which is causing 2 major issues. One is wage inflation, and it's a simple supply and demand issue. There's not enough supply to meet the demand. So salaries are going up dramatically, and people really having to rethink that salaries in their OPEX budget. And the second one is attrition. I think attrition is running at an all-time high, and we've looked at some companies' OPEX budgets, and I think they've massively undercooked what attrition really could be. And I think people expect their attrition to be about 30%. I think a lot of these operating platforms are running at 50% plus. So yeah, I don't want to sound incredibly negative, but this, I guess, insistence of sector experience, I understand why it's useful and having someone who can hit the ground running. But that will only further cause issues with wage inflation, attrition. And again, I don't want to feel like I'm just coming with a problem. What we want to do is come with a solution, and the solution is, we've got to go and find talent, and we've got to attract people to the sector that people perhaps haven't heard of before. And you're right, I think we've started to do and do a good job of is identify the skill sets and personality traits that work in the sector, and sort of identify where what are the sectors that they exist in, and within operating companies, that those are the people who are managing buildings once they're open, and those are the people who are keeping them alive and moving. Those personality traits sit very much in the hospitality sectors, so hotels, high-end leisure, airlines, purpose-built student accommodation, any sort of service sectors, retail as well. But the challenge is great. It would be great to bring those people in, but equally, build-to-rent is a new space. There is some technical jargon that they won't know about, and managing a customer in a Selfridges store is going to be slightly different to managing a tenant who lives long term in a build-to-rent scheme. So there is an educational piece, and there are brilliant qualifications out there that we know, like the ALA qualification, the IRPM, which are useful tools. But I think there's a lot more we can do there. And I also think to bring down wage inflation, I think we need to be attracting more people into the sort of the graduate or the entry level positions. You can actually grow into the role. And I look at the PBSA sector, and I think they were very good at that. I see people who came in as, I'm going to say, CSA, or a customer service advisor, you might call it, and people would progress. They then go to assistant manager, then accommodation manager, city manager, regional, head of ops. And I've seen some individuals who've gone all the way to a CEO. And in an ideal world, companies don't want to be having to replacing their senior level staff and having to pay large fees and large salaries to get those people. You want to be feeding into this entry level talent who can grow within your business. So my short answer became very long, but that's what I honestly see.
That leads me nicely on to I read a comment from you online, actually. You said employers are now having to be highly creative in formulating a successful attraction and retention strategy. So how are they being creative to attract and retain people?
Definitely. So I think when we sit down with a lot of our clients, and they're having these very issues we've spoken about, what we do is we examine the business and we look at how they're operating, and branding is really interesting because a lot of companies invest in their customer brand, They're very active online, and the brand looks fantastic. But what actually they forget sometimes is to focus on their employer brand. And there's a term which I'm sure you will have heard of, but in case anybody hasn't, EVP, employer value proposition. And an employer value proposition is the sort of, why do people come? Why do they stay? Where are you going? What's the company's mission? What are the cultural behaviors that you want those people to adopt? And why do they stay? And when you build a successful EVP program, that's what builds loyalty, and that's what allows people to stay. And it's that sort of expectation versus reality. If you're told one thing and you come and there's absolutely nothing in place, and you don't get promotion, you don't get that pay rise, and the culture isn't what you thought it would be, that causes unrest. But when you've built that before, and everything everything is expected happens, that builds trust. And I think the view is, if you employee value proposition, it equals happy employees. Happy employees means they will deliver better service and inline your customer, happy customers. So it's business critical. You think about that first before anything.
So talking about EVP, Deverellsmith, you were 7th in the UK, 100 best. Yep. In the 100 best small companies to work for. So what can other companies, either in recruitment or not in recruitment, learn from you guys about EVP?
So we, Andrew and our managing director, James Campion, came up with a really interesting idea a couple of years ago. In recruitment or a sales environment, it is your reward is linked to perhaps your output and revenue you're generating, and it is a sales environment. And while of course that is important for the business, we felt that we wanted to reward people based on sort of meeting the cultural behaviors of the business. So we introduced a concept called the culture bonus, and it's not linked to fees. It's linked to you meeting cultural behaviors. And forgive me, I should know them off by heart. One is positivity. The other is being progressive. The other is put me on the spot here. I should know this. But they link to our culture behaviors, and we get a score. And I guess what that it means is that we're hiring people we hire people who live and breathe our values, and will get rewarded for that. Which I think sends a really positive message out there.
Next, I want to talk about candidates, and hopefully talk to candidates. As is the benefit of podcasting. Hopefully you can reach lots of people rather than just one at a time. So what makes a great candidate for the build to rent industry?
I think, look, it will depend on the role that you're looking for. I guess should we pick a role in particular? Maybe like
talk about general manager, for example.
General manager, fine. So I think absolutely, a general manager in a build to rent scheme, it was historically a very difficult role to recruit, because there's a very diverse set of skills needed to do that. So if I go through the competencies, leading a team, that's number one. Number two, it's the customer experience piece, which we've spoken about quite a lot. Number three, someone who can manage health and safety of a building. Number four, someone who can manage a P&L, manage an OPEX budget. Number five, someone who can manage health and safety of the building. I don't know if I've mentioned that already. But as you can see, there's a lot of different components there, and actually trying to identify somebody who's done all of those things, it's actually really difficult. And if you look at like an estate agent, people go, could a property manager and an estate agency do it? They might be able to, but do they operate working in a front of house role where they're managing people and they're going into the detail? Probably not. That's where we look at hotel managers and accommodation managers and student, because they're doing something very similar. Sorry, that's the one I missed. Leasing or sales, the leasing of the units. So finding someone who's done all of these things was really difficult, and that's where we've looked at people with those transferable skills. I think so that's more the sort of the experience and the skill set. In terms of sort of personality traits, I think property is, I personally believe it's a very social, a very nice sector. I think everybody is quite collaborative. I think everyone's quite fun. on a Friday on a Friday, or now a Thursday, given everyone works home on a Friday, you can never really get hold of anyone because everybody's going out socializing in some shape or form. So I think it's someone who enjoys interaction, enjoys being with people, and wants to sort of foster that through their team as well.
Is
I
there
think it's yeah, I've just thought of another one as well. It sounds a bit cliche saying resilience, but I do have a huge respect for anyone who works in property management, because I think you're dealing with difficult situations and quite often unhappy tenants who having something wrong go in their property, and you're having to face the brunt of it, and sometimes that's out of your control. And I think the view is when if you want to reduce stress or get through your workload, it's actually getting through it and actioning it. But I know property management, that doesn't always happen, and you might have an issue and you wish you could sort it out on that day before you go home and you can relax. But no, it might go into the next day because you've got to get a specialist contractor in, or there's someone else that needs to take a look at it. And I would find that very difficult to switch off, going home, not completing the task. So I think it's a level of resilience. And I can imagine at the start it's harder, but the more experience you get, the more used to it you are. So yeah, no, I really commend people who work in any sort of property management role in the sector.
Is there somebody, you don't have to name them, but is there somebody you've recruited in Build to Rent you think, yeah, I really got that one right?
I think we recruited a lady called Alex Morrison at Goodstone Living. She is their operations director. She worked previously in PBSA. I think she worked in Urban Nest. And then she was working at Real Star Group for about 8 years. Brilliant candidate, can demonstrate a level of loyalty. I think there's been this huge secular shift where perhaps people don't stay in their roles as long as they used to. But definitely had demonstrated loyalty there, and she'd gone in to achieve everything she wanted to do, and was quite unique in that she demonstrated all the skill sets that I'd mentioned. She'd done it in a BTR environment, and she's going to a platform who really need a safe pair of hands and sort of that market expert who can make those decisions. And to make things easier, she's a lovely person.
that definitely always helps, I'm sure. I guess, I mean, I don't want to preempt the answer, but is there certain roles you're hiring for now that you weren't hiring for previously?
Yeah. So I've been at deverellsmith for about 5.5 years now. And when I started in the business, we were focused only on the ops side, which I've perhaps talked quite heavily about this session. And those are the people who, once a building is open, who are the people who keep it alive and moving, and those are everyone from the front of house team to the building manager. And that's been great, but there's a whole life cycle out there in property, and I guess what we've done the last couple of years and what I've been involved in is actually how can we support clients across that entire build to rent life cycle. So there's other disciplines to consider. So the first discipline is investment. Those are people who think about doing deals. So it could be an investment manager, it could be an acquisitions person, and those are the people who are doing all the underwriting and all the deal execution and the negotiation to actually make it happen. The second discipline that we've been involved in now is development construction. So once the deal's completed, who are the people who think about building buildings? Those are your development managers, your construction people, your builders, project managers, who actually bring the whole thing to life. Third discipline I mentioned is operations. And then the fourth discipline, corporate services. So who are the people who sort of maintain the life cycle of any business? So it could be HR, marketing, finance, legal. So I think me personally, we've really pushed across all of those disciplines, and I'm really pleased we've done that. I don't think we've scratched the surface. I think there's lots of areas we still haven't. I think what's been more exciting to me, Gareth, is that we're also touching on the geographies. We've been historically very focused on the UK. Build to rent is not a new concept globally. The US, it's an incredibly mature market over there. Just to give you an example of scale, Dallas, which is one city in Texas, has over 1 million build to rent apartments. They call it multifamily over there, which makes it a little bit more confusing.
That's because we're obsessed with home ownership in this country rather than renting. Whereas
Exactly.
you don't find that in certain other countries. Well,
And
maybe
the buildings are interesting over there. Perhaps the customers' needs are slightly different. What we want in the UK, and they're heavily amenitized, and they have everything from dog parlors to absolutely everything you can think of. There are other countries as well. So Germany is a very big renting society. There's a lot of build to rent over there. The other places we're focused on at the moment, Australia, you very much have sort of the same components as the UK. A huge shortage of housing, another housing crisis being unaffordable for people to buy, and they've got around 5,000 to 10,000 live at the moment. So yeah, it's apart from managing about 3 time zones, it's really fun to work in those different locations.
And something I've been talking a lot about on this podcast is flexible working, and I know we touched on it. I see deverellsmith recently acquired Daisy Chain.
Correct.
So, I mean, for those of you listening who don't know about Daisy Chain, maybe you could describe what that is and how that's sort of going to play a role in perhaps filling the gaps in traditional recruitment, if it is.
Absolutely. So the Daisy Chain, yeah, we acquired the business 2 weeks ago. It's led by a lady called Louise, and Daisy Chain is a platform which connects people who are looking for flexible work and connects them with employers who are looking to hire flexible contracts. So that could be anything from some ad hoc work. They might, a company might need someone for a couple of weeks to do some admin. It could be looking for someone, but perhaps they don't need them to start till midday, or they can leave earlier. And it's very much been, I guess, grew in real estate, because we've been very well connected to the business. But it's been set up to support clients across all sectors. So that's brilliant, been a brilliant tool for us, and I think it's a big win to bring Daisy Chain on board. And I think it's flexible working is here to stay, as much as not everybody wants it. It is here to stay, and there's a huge group of people who are seeking it. So I think it's going to be a really good platform, and I hope in my sector, build to rent as well.
One thing people ask me a lot about is certainly about, and they've asked me to ask guests, is we want to find out a little bit more about you. Obviously, we talked a little bit about you at the start, but what does your daily routine look like, if you have one?
Yeah, I'd love to have a brilliant routine and say I get up, go to the gym, go for a run, but it doesn't always turn out that way. But look, in recruitment or in executive search, there are some consistencies, but ultimately every day is slightly different, and that is usually based on projects we're working on, who we're working with, and where they are. So, for example, I was at MIPIM, which is a big property conference in France. So I could be there 1 week. Next week, I'm in Leeds for UK Brief, which is another property conference. But if I look at a normal week, I wake up at 7. Used to do earlier, but as I spoke to you earlier, I'm really focused on trying to have 8 hours sleep. So I very strictly try and do that 11 till 7 now. I think in the mornings when we're in the office, and I'm always in Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I think we have an internal rule at deverellsmith that perhaps we're no one's out, perhaps at meetings, but all at the desk, and we're making calls. And I think in a sales business, it's really good to have that sort of collaboration and that energy. The issue we had with the pandemic was that we found that the office was only ever 50% full every day, and that was a real issue to try and maintain that energy and that culture that Andrew had built in the business. So we have everybody in every morning, and that's where we're speaking to candidates, speaking to clients, and it could be anything from candidates who are looking for work to candidates who are in process with us at the moment, and absolutely the same for clients. In the afternoon, that is absolutely time for going out, meeting people, building relationships, and there's a lot of flexibility. I can do what, it doesn't have to be at someone's office. Go out for a drink. We can go out for some lunch. We can have a couple of drinks, and that doesn't stop into the evening as well. So it sounds like there's a lot. I'm on the phone a lot and I'm meeting a lot of people, and actually I have to make sure I have time to complete those tasks like formatting CVs, submitting shortlists, giving feedback, giving updates, and that's where my work from home days on a Monday and Friday can be incredibly useful. But as I mentioned at the start, I have a full-time researcher, Rachel, who works for me. She's the brain box doing all the hard work and the mapping and the contacting behind the scenes, and that's made my life a lot easier to actually go out and network and build relationships. So after that's all done, I'd like to think I'd try and go for a run, and I do most times. It depends how you feel. I'm only a human being.
I do enjoy the videos I've seen on LinkedIn of you walking to work. I assume you're walking to work, giving us an update on the sector. I think.
Yeah, I've done it twice now, and everybody's like, "Yeah, you should keep doing that. It's a quarterly update." And I like to be very honest.
I think that's probably why it resonates with people.
I guess
I have this. I've never worked in recruitment. Obviously, I know a lot of people in the industry, but my sort of perception of it is incredibly fast paced, hard targets, relentless. Trying to make sure that you're getting candidates over, and that's it takes a lot of organising. To get the right candidates.
You're absolutely right, and that's very typical in a contingent recruitment business. And that in a contingent recruitment business, perhaps they're working on roles and they're working at volumes. They're managing various projects at once, and perhaps they're working. There's other agencies who are working at the same time, and they need to move very quickly. What I do is actually it's proper search, and there's a process that goes in behind it, but what actually that means is that the time taken to execute that project can be a lot longer. So the mandates that we sort of advise clients that they could take between 12 and 14 weeks from you instruct us to doing a shortlist, run the interview process, do all the research, and place the candidate. It should take 12 to 14 weeks, and then you have to factor in a notice period. So searches, we wish they could be as quick as that, but they can take up to a year. So I think my role's dramatically changed, where actually it's pretty it's a lot more slow paced than it used to be. But the team beneath me who are doing that ops stuff, you're absolutely right. They're working at 100 miles per hour.
I guess managing people's expectations that getting the right hire can take up to a year is might be quite difficult sometimes.
Absolutely, but I think my view is that having the right people in the key positions is business critical. And that can be the single determining factor of whether a business succeeds or not.
Okay, so we've come to the time of quick fire round questions. So what advice would you give to someone who wants to change their direction but doesn't know where to start?
I think don't be scared to make the first move, and don't be scared to make mistakes. The example I used at the start, I threw myself in the deep end and put myself in some situations I was very uncomfortable with. But make that step, see that as a success. Don't worry if you have any drawbacks, and actually just keep going.
And if you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
I would remove social media. And I'm one of those people that uses it. But I think the world would be a lot happier place I think it'd be a lot happier place without it. No judging. My dad was a teacher, and he was always moaning to me about some incident that happened with pupils over Snapchat, and this was over 10 years ago. And he was like, "Do you know what this is?" I'm like, "Yeah." Life would be a lot easier.
Okay, and what is going to be your next big change?
So it is exactly what I told you. The executive search business, so deverellsmith are going to we're launching a new sub-brand within the group, only focus on executive search. And while I've been involved in senior hires over the last 2 years, I guess we're going to the next level, and it's going to be looking solely after C-suite or board level positions. That's a big challenge, but I'm really excited for it. And I guess it solidifies my career at deverellsmith for the next couple of years.
Okay, and final question as always, if you were to recommend a guest for me to speak to on Know Your Shift, who would it be and why?
There's a couple of people I can recommend. I think you should definitely speak to Nicola Bruman, who is she's a director at deverellsmith. She's a very much a trailblazer of women in property. She's highly successful and known in the estate agency space, and she's a lot of fun. The second person I'd speak to is a chap called Sam Smith. I won't announce what he does yet because he's about to do something. But he's a build-to-rent guru. He's worked in lots of senior ops roles. He's worked at Dandara, worked at Countrywide, worked at Get Living. You'll have a great chat with him.
Great. Well, we'll certainly reach out to them once the episode's out, see if we can have some conversations with them. So just want to say thanks very much for coming on Know Your Shift, Nick. It's been really great to talk to you, and I really wanted to get you on the podcast, particularly talking about build to rent and recruitment, and we got through a few things certainly in and out of the sector. And yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Gareth. Appreciate it.